Hi, my name is Brian Brinker. I'm going to be discussing State of Utah versus Jeffrey McIntyre Roberts. This is an appeal to a conviction of theft by deception. Um, Before we get into to the actual case, I think which I've got here. This is from 1985. It was in the Supreme Court of Utah. Um, Mr. Roberts is appealing his conviction of theft by deception. Theft by deception, and I think what this appeal really revolves around is is trying to come up with what the actual essential elements of the crime are and establishing that, um, and that will really determine the outcome of the trial for Mr. Roberts. Um, excuse me. Uh, so we have theft by deception. Uh, the elements and its definition in the Utah Criminal Code 76-6-405. There are a couple parts here that refer to puffing, which is basically an exaggerated comment made that no reasonable person would take as a serious offer. That's not really part of this case, and I'm just going to kind of set those parts to the side here, and we're just going to go over what pertains to this case. So we have theft by deception. In my slide here, I've got kind of just three keywords that are part of the that basically make up the essential elements. The definition here is a person commits theft if the person obtains or exercises control over property of another person by deception and with a purpose to deprive the other person of property. So if you have somebody committing the crime and a victim, um, the person committing the crime proposes or creates a some sort of an agreement to be entered into, and the victim enters this agreement um, or is influenced to enter this agreement based on a deceptive proposal by the person committing the crime. And once they have been influenced based on this proposal to enter the agreement and to give this person control of their property, at that point the person committing the crime deprives the victim of their property and does not carry out the proposal or the action or the expected outcome for the victim. Um, so the key point here is that the reason the victim enters into this agreement is because they have a specific outcome that they expect, and that is what influences their entry into this agreement. Um, they don't know, obviously, that this is a deceptive outcome. It's not going to happen. And the person that they're entering this agreement with, their intent is to deprive them of their property, and that's it. They don't intend to commit to their end of the deal or to provide that person with the specific outcome that they promised. I think it's, I don't want to go over it too many times, but I think that's important um, because those are the essential elements of this crime. The code also goes so far as to give a definition of when theft by deception does not occur. Theft by deception does not occur when there's only falsity as to matters having no pecuniary significance. This is also important to this case. Pecuniary significance or pecuniary loss is essentially monetary loss. Um, so falsity as to matters having no monetary loss. Quick example would be uh, if a car salesman misrepresents his religious affiliation to gain um, patronage from a buyer, um, you could argue that the money obtained for that buyer from that buyer for the car was obtained through deceptive means. In this case, he misrepresented his religious affiliation, perhaps to gain favor with the buyer. What you cannot argue, though, is that the buyer entered an agreement in which the expected outcome was to receive a car um, if they were to give money to the dealership. So the deal here, what the buyer is bargaining for, is to receive a car in exchange for their money. That has been satisfied completely in this deal. So they cannot come after the car salesman and claim that they theft by deception and try to charge him with theft by deception based on the fact that he misrepresented his religious affiliation. They received no injuries from their deal, and they received exactly what they told they were going to get. So I think the intent of putting that in there was to protect someone from being convicted of theft by deception. It was not put in there to define theft by deception, and that is a key point. So we have control, deceive, and deprive. Those are all actions that have to be done by the person committing this crime. So as we move on into the appeal, Mr. Roberts had 2 points of appeal, and I don't think we have time to go over the initial trial, so I'm going to try to just give the pertinent information to these. The first point of appeal was that in the initial trial, which was tried by a jury in a district court, in the initial trial, Mr. Roberts is claiming that pecuniary loss is an essential element of theft by deception, and the court failed to provide sufficient evidence that the victim suffered pecuniary loss. In that trial, Mr. Roberts moved to have the verdict be such that he was not guilty of theft by deception because of insufficient evidence of an essential element of the crime being pecuniary loss. That motion was denied by the judge. At that point, Mr. Roberts made a second motion to have the judge instruct on pecuniary loss. In a trial, the judge is required to instruct on essential elements of the crime. Obviously, in this case, the judge did not perceive or not believe that pecuniary loss was an essential element, and he denied the motion to instruct on that. So in this appeal, Mr. Roberts is claiming that due to the fact that pecuniary loss is an essential element and the judge failed to instruct on it in the original trial, the judge committed a reversible error. The reversible error basically means that this error was of a nature that was enough to be able to influence the jury or the court in their conviction of Mr. Roberts. And since this error was made by the judge, and it would influence the outcome of the trial, he could then have his conviction reversed based on this error. He cited State of Utah versus Johnson to establish pecuniary loss as an essential element. In that case, the defendant was not convicted of theft by deception based on the fact, on a fact being that the victim suffered no pecuniary loss in that trial. That was his basis. He's basing pecuniary loss being an essential element because the person in the defendant in Utah versus Johnson was not convicted based on the fact that the victim did not suffer pecuniary loss. That was his basis. What he did not also state was that the other reason the defendant was not convicted of theft by deception was that the victim received exactly what they bargained for. They entered an agreement with the defendant to receive a certain outcome and to pay him for it. They paid their money. They received what they bargained for. So there was no nothing there to define the essential elements of theft by deception. There was no control, there was no deception, and there was no depriving of property. So really you could argue that the pecuniary loss is not necessary. There was no elements there at all to show theft by deception. The court obviously is saying that the essential elements do not include pecuniary loss, and therefore there was no reversible error. He's not required to instruct on elements that are not essential. They base their decision off of the same code that I read you, and they used Utah versus Walton, among many other cases, to prove that pecuniary loss was very rarely played a role in theft by deception. In the case of Utah versus Walton, there was no evidence, or actually there was evidence of pecuniary loss along with the other evidence of control, deceit, and deprivation. So that they sort of use that as a basis to show that pecuniary loss was shown, but it was not necessary that it be shown due to the fact that the other elements were proven. So in that case, Mr. Roberts' conviction held in the appeals court, so I think what it shows us is the importance of knowing the elements of the crime, the elements of the case, having a full understanding of what those are. In this case, pecuniary loss was not an essential element and therefore could not be relied on as a defense. And the use of precedent in this case, or previous trials, it's also important to really go over what all that involves and what was involved in that case, as they only chose to, as the defendant in this case only chose to focus on one aspect of the trial. And that also leads me to your choice of lawyer is also important. Perhaps they had to do what they had to do to try to get out of this conviction. Maybe they had really nothing to go on and this was the best argument they could come up with, or perhaps the lawyer just wasn't very good. I'm not really sure, but that's something to think about. Hopefully that covers theft by deception and kind of gives you an overview of how that case went. Thank you very much for listening.